Good morning, everybody. I think today we've got an absolutely fascinating presentation. I'm obviously a little bit biased. I think age-related muscle loss is absolutely fascinating. Hopefully you'll learn a little bit. Obviously, who am I, first of all? You don't know me, although I did do a presentation about 8 weeks ago on healthy aging. My name's Max. I did my PhD about 40 years ago. That's a long time ago, Nottingham. I then worked for Procter & Gamble for a few years. I then went to work for Reckitt Benckiser. I eventually became their global research and development director worldwide. So had lots of teams across the world developing lots of products. I also more recently worked in sports nutrition, worked for a company called PhD Nutrition. I also started my own company called Prime 50, which are supplements that specialize on over 50s. And I've now sold the company to Future Cambridge, and I'm now their Chief Scientific Officer. Okay, so let's get going. Let's talk about healthy aging and muscle loss. Okay, here we are. So we're living longer. That's the good news. You can see two lines there, a green line and a red line. And you can see that females are living quite a lot longer than males, 3 or 4 years more. And over the last 20, 30 years, you can see the lines getting bigger and bigger and bigger, which is brilliant. They've leveled off a little bit over the last couple of years. But this is 2017 data. I haven't seen the latest, but you'll find out that it's leveling off a bit. But I'm not interested necessarily in just lifespan. There's something much more important called health span. So look at these two little arrows. So at the top, we've got normal aging, the green, and then people enter a bad phase in their lives, perhaps, where they have chronic diseases, maybe even disabilities, and that's the red part. So that is healthy aging in the green and less healthy aging in the red, and that's total lifespan. In a perfect world, we want optimal longevity, which is the bottom arrow. But we would also like to what they call compress the morbidity. If we can have that last bit as compressed as possible, the little bit of red at the tip of the arrow, then that's what we really want. We want to live a long health span, not necessarily a long lifespan. Don't worry, it's a little bit busy, this chart. I'm not going to go through the data. But are we living healthier? Well, you can see females at the top, males at the bottom, split by UK and parts of the UK. Just cast your eye over to the right-hand side. I'll just use the pointer here. So if you look down here, this is really the proportion of life spent in good health. So it's about 80%, which means about 20% is spent in bad health. And that's the bit that we really want to try and address. This is a fascinating little graph. This is from the ONS, and it's pretty much up to date, 2022. And this basically is the number of years people can expect to spend without a disabling health condition, and it's falling. So if you take the most dramatic line, that's the women line, the green line, you can see that a few years ago, women had about 63, 64 years. Now they only have about 60 to 61 years spent in good health. So instead of healthy aging getting better, it's actually getting worse. And that's not good news. So I thought you'd like to see that. Let's talk about real people for a second. Prime 50 did a lot of research. We produced a white paper some time ago. And we actually interviewed over 1,000 over 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we asked them lots of health questions. But one of the things we said was, what do you want out of life as you age? And the really, really important bottom line was, look, I just want to stay active, stay mobile, stay independent, very, very important. I just want to carry on doing the things that I love doing, going on holidays, playing with the grandkids, that kind of stuff. Now, when you're 30, that doesn't mean a great deal. When you're 60, 70, 80, that is very, very, very important. But what do we need to stay active? Okay, there are many ways of staying active, but there are 3 fundamental parts of the system. I call it the musculoskeletal health system. We have to try and keep our joints in reasonable condition, because stiff joints can slow us down and make life quite painful. We want to look after our bone health, But we also need to look after our muscle health. And that's really what today's discussion is all about. Now, losing muscle as we get older, which happens, is very, very unhealthy. In fact, it's the biggest cause of functional decline, which then leads, obviously, to frailty. And nobody wants to become frail. Certainly, we don't want to become frail too early in life. And loss of muscle starts really not at old age, it starts in our 40s, and we start to lose muscle mass. And we know from a lot of scientific publications that losing muscle is predictive of overall lifespan. That is quite an interesting fact. So let's go right back to square one. I'm not going to dwell on it in great detail, but let's start. What is muscle mass? What is muscle tissue, first of all? And again, I'm not going to go through this in detail. But we have basically three types of muscle. Skeletal muscle, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, where the muscles attach to bones for movement. Then we have smooth muscle, like the GI tract, bladder, uterus, blood vessels. And then we have the very important cardiac muscle, which is the walls of the heart. So if you look at the little diagram here, you can see that this is like the muscle belly, if you like. If you look inside a muscle, there's lots of little strands of rope, little strands. And if you take one of those strands and then and put that under a microscope, that's composed of strands. If you take one of those strands, that's composed of strands, otherwise known as myofibrils. And then eventually you go right down to the basic proteins, myosin and actin. You might have heard of myosin. Actin, perhaps not, I'm not sure. But these are the fundamental proteins in muscle. So you can see muscle, it's like a rope within a rope within a rope. It's an amazing structure. There are basically two types of muscle fibers. There's type 1 and type 2. I'm sure you've heard of these. Type 1 is slow twitch. Type 2 is fast twitch. And without reading all the text, the fast twitch are the explosive, powerful muscles that we have. So somebody who sprints will have fast twitch, explosive muscles. Somebody who's a long distance runner will have very well developed type 1, slow twitch, low power muscles. But if you look at the blue at the bottom, the type 2 muscle fibers, they are typically the muscles that are lost with aging. And that's why we tend to lose balance, because we tend to use type 2 for balance. So I don't want to be too technical, because I'm a biochemist by training, so I do love the science. But let's go back to what is a protein. And I think it's important to understand this because I'm going to be talking about amino acids in general a bit later on. Amino acid is the fundamental building block of protein. I think you've all heard of amino acids, but if you look at the diagram here, top left, that is an amino acid. Why is it called an amino acid? Well, basically, there's an NH2 group here. That's called an amino group if you're a chemist. On the right-hand side, there's a carboxyl group, which is an acid, hence the amino acid. And then in the middle, attached to the middle carbon, there's what we call an R group, a side chain. And these side chains can be very, very complex or very, very simple. And it's the R group that gives the amino acid its name and its structure. Now, if you take amino acids, sometimes they join together, and you call that a peptide. And if you get lots of peptides joining together, where you have even more amino acids, you end up with a protein. So a protein is basically composed of many, many, many amino acids. Interestingly, 40% of the body weight is muscle, and 20% of muscle is pure protein. So we have a lot of protein in our body, and it is the fundamental building block of muscle. Now, again, we don't need to look at the detail, but it's there as a record. We have around 20 amino acids, okay? And I'm not going to go through all of them. I used to be able to draw the structures of all of these 40 years ago. I can draw a few now, but not all 40, not all 20. But if I can just cast your eye to the top right, we've got non-essential and essential amino acids. Now, you've probably heard of essential amino acids. So of the 20, 9 are absolutely essential. That means you have to get them from the diet. They cannot be made inside the body. The non-essential amino acids, though they're important, they can be made from other amino acids that you ingest as part of your diet. Okay, so the essential amino acids, that's something that is fundamental to muscle structure and muscle mass. And if you're lacking those essential amino acids, you're going to be lacking muscle protein synthesis. So just going to structure again. Again, I don't want to dwell too much on this. But top left, if you look at the amino acid here, that's just a different way of portraying the amino acid I showed you before. Amino acids, like I said, join together into a primary structure, a peptide or a protein. Sometimes the protein then wraps around itself into a secondary structure or architecture, and then it can wrap around itself again into what's called a tertiary structure. And then if you get a few of these proteins joined together, it's a quaternary structure. Don't worry too much about that. I think the fundamental point I'm trying to make here is that a protein has to be in a perfect structure, architecture, for it to do its job. We have proteins in our bodies. Every single protein does an important biochemical job in our bodies, but it must have that proper structure. And if you start to denature that protein, I'm sure you've heard of denature before, then you ruin the ability of that protein to carry out its job. So protein is important, but you have to have it in the right structure. Okay, so what happens when we ingest protein? Well, it goes into the stomach, pH 1, hydrochloric acid and pepsin, and basically it chops up the protein into the individual peptides and amino acids. And also the small intestines further break down using enzymes to individual amino acids. You can see the amino acid here on the right-hand side again. Now the amino acid can then be used to make energy, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, but it's unlikely. It can also be used to make more glucose, which is called gluconeogenesis, new sugar. More likely, though, the protein and the amino acids are there to make new muscle. That's where most of the amino acids will be used, because we're always breaking down muscle on a daily basis, so it has to be rebuilt. And then the amino acids will also make other proteins. So let's just quickly look at that. Muscle tissue, we're going to be talking about that in a lot more detail, but protein is also used to make signaling molecules. It's there to make collagen tissues, which are used in cartilage, in skin, and a lot more. It's used to make bones. The bone matrix isn't just calcium and phosphorus or hydroxyapatite. It's also composed of collagen. That's the spongy mass which keeps the bone together, making the bone a little bit more flexible. Hemoglobin, that is a protein, very important. Many enzymes are protein, and some hormones, for example, insulin, is also protein. Proteins are also needed to repair cells. Cells are always undergoing growth, but also undergoing repair. So getting protein into the body and using it is very, very important. It's used all over the body for many, many different things. Okay, muscles. How do they work? Very briefly. We have over 600 skeletal muscles. Like I said, between 30 and 40% of our weight is muscle. The muscle receives signals from motor neurons, and that messages the muscles to contract or relax. And muscles are innervated by motor neurons, okay? And they come from the brain, the cord, to contract the muscle fiber, and it releases calcium, etc. Now, as we age, we have less calcium channels, so the muscle's less effective. Myosin, remember that was the base protein, that changes its structure. There's DNA damage, so we get a decline in mitochondrial function. Remember, mitochondria are the energy parts, the little batteries, if you like, in each cell, which make energy. Type 2 fibers, as I said 5 minutes ago, the fast twitch tend to decrease. And we have what's called denervation. In other words, our innervation isn't actually as responsive as before. So, how do muscles grow? Well, they can grow due to a whole range of factors. They can grow due to growth factors, things like testosterone, estrogen, IGF-1. These are various hormones which actually help muscle grow. Testosterone levels increase during exercise, for example, and that stimulates growth. IGF-1, I'm sure you've heard about, stimulates MPS, muscle protein synthesis. During exercise, the muscle fibers or fibrils, they're damaged. So nature's very clever. It says, hey, I need to make new fibrils, but I'll make them a bit stronger, a bit bigger. And that's how hypertrophy works, which is where you're muscle building. Very importantly, though, the rate of muscle protein synthesis, MPS, has to be bigger than muscle protein breakdown. If that equilibrium is the other way, you will lose muscle. And that's where sarcopenia sets in. This is age-related muscle loss. So we must ensure we have excess protein to grow muscle. Low protein will produce a catabolic state. That's the problem. We do not want to be in a catabolic, i.e. muscle losing state. And obviously, catabolism, muscle loss, occurs during rest, not in the gym. When you're in the gym, you're actually breaking down muscle. You're not building it up. And sleep is obviously very, very important. So let's talk about age-related muscle loss. We've set the scene now. We've talked about muscle and what makes it work. We've talked about amino acids, a little bit of simple chemistry. Now let's talk about age-related muscle loss, sarcopenia. You will all have heard of sarcopenia, but it's not exactly a commonly known word. There was an article in the New York Times recently, and they said as a headline, in future, sarcopenia will be known as much as osteoporosis is today. That's important. 99% of people still have no clue what sarcopenia is, but I think that may change. Right, let's look at sarcopenia. We've got 2 MRI scans. This is a young person, male or female, it doesn't matter. You can see in the middle there's the white bone. You can see the muscle mass, the gray, and then around that you've got skin and fat mass. And that's through the upper thigh, the upper legs. If you look at an older person, and 63 is not old, but it is older, this is classic sarcopenia. This is age-related muscle loss. So you've got a massive reduction in total muscle, but you've got a lot of fat ingress coming into the muscle. So it's a low-quality muscle. And you can see these two people have got a similar BMI. If you looked at their legs, they look, similar thickness. But inside, there's very, very different things going on. So sarcopenia, what is it? It's age-related loss of muscle, but also there's dynapenia going on too. That's just the techie term for loss of strength. And it is the greatest cause of functional decline and ultimate frailty. That's the most important thing. And it starts in our 40s in reality. And we lose about 1 and sometimes 2% every single year. That means by the time you're 65, maybe you've lost a quarter of your muscle mass and probably more than a quarter of your strength. And like I said before, loss of muscle is predictive of overall lifespan. 30% of people over 60 experience chronic muscle loss. And without regular exercise, men and women at 80, roughly, will have lost between 30 and half of their total muscle mass. And 10 to 20% of older adults are at risk of losing some of their independence because of sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is very, very important. This is a fascinating graph. I won't dwell on it too much, but this was an experiment done on older and younger people where they were asked to lie down in a hospital bed for 28 days. And they measured the loss of muscle. So on youngish people, on average 38 years old, in 28 days lying in a hospital bed doing nothing, they were only allowed to go to the toilet, they lost about 400 grams. That's quite a lot of muscle. But they repeated it with 52-year-olds, and they lost over a kilo, 1.2 kilograms in 14 days. They had to stop the experiment. It was just unethical continuing. And then they repeated it with 67-year-olds, and they lost nearly a kilo in just 10 days. And this is why a lot of people say we have to keep older people out of hospital if we can. A lot of people laying in hospital beds, literally getting sicker and sicker because they're losing huge amounts of muscle mass. So this is really, really important. to avoid if possible. But it doesn't have to be that way. This is a beautiful MRI scan. If you look at the right-hand side, that's an older person, 74 years old, and she has done very little exercise and probably eaten a bad diet, probably very low in protein. And you can see that the sarcopenia has really set in. Very small muscle mass, a lot of fat mass. Some people would call that not sarcopenia, but sarcobesity, which is another term. Whereas the person on the left is very lean, 70 years old, and you can see his muscle is in fantastic condition. So, okay, genetically, I'm sure he had some good genes as well, but he's obviously been a very, very high exercising person throughout his or her life. Sorry about this slide, it's a little bit busy, but let me go through it because there are some key points. So muscle loss is multifaceted. First of all, muscle protein breakdown is more than muscle protein synthesis. This equals muscle loss. And then muscle is sensitive to stimulus. So if you reduce mechanical load, if you're not doing resistance exercise, you will have muscle atrophy. So we'll talk about resistance exercise later, but it's very, very important. If you're in pain or if you're recovering post-op, you will be sedentary and therefore you will lose large amounts of muscle mass. We all, as we get older, have a decline in hormones, and that decline in hormones, especially testosterone, don't forget women have testosterone as well, can cause a large decline. Inflammation, or inflammaging, as a lot of people are calling it now, that causes a catabolic state and it accelerates as we age. Little bit technical. As we get older, we have what's called a dysregulated mTORC1 activity. This is the process in the body which actually triggers muscle protein synthesis, and that pathway tends to get disrupted as we get a bit older. We have less mitochondria. Some of the mitochondria die, and some of them become less effective. Don't forget the mitochondria are the energy-producing parts of the cell in our body, which makes ATP. Type 2 fibers, remember we talked about that, they decay. Anabolic stimuli is attenuated in older adults, therefore we have less muscle protein synthesis. And then again, slightly technical, there is a belief that a lot of the protein and the amino acids we ingest don't all go to the muscle. A lot of them are used in various organs, liver, heart, kidney, etc. And that's called splanchnic sequestration, a nice technical term. Also, reduced vasodilation post-insulin peaks. We have a lesser response to nutrients that we eat. A lot of older people are just simply not getting enough protein in their diet, and we'll talk about the RDA later, which is a little bit out of date. And I'm sure you are well aware that there is more and more research going on the microbiome. And as you get older, we have this dysbiosis where we have more bad bugs than good bugs, and this dysbiosis can also cause muscle loss. So again, a busy slide that, but there is a lot going on which is causing our muscles to deteriorate. So sarcopenia, it's also associated with a bunch of other things. It's associated with a decline in our neurology. It's also associated with cellular senescence. This is when our cells are starting to slow down and not die, but go to sleep. They slow down and they start to produce inflammatory materials. Hormonal changes, testosterone and IGF-1. Inflammation over time. We talked about inflammaging. This is down to a mechanism called oxidative stress. Okay, and that gets worse as we get older. We talked about dysfunction, or less effective function of the mitochondria. Older people, or sarcopenia, is associated with perhaps more of a sedentary lifestyle. It's certainly associated with poor nutrition, especially a low protein intake. Vitamin D is really important, as we'll talk about later. Less appetite, if you're taking in less protein, that's not good. That's not good for muscle health. It's also associated with other chronic diseases, such as osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, and COPD. And of course, very importantly, it's associated with the risk of falling. And that, when you fall over when you're 25, it's all a bit of a laugh. If you fall over when you're 65, 70, you could die. You do get people falling over when they're older and dying as a result, banging their head or whatever. So let's talk about that. This is a graph which I just find fascinating, and it explains what I call a catabolic crisis quite nicely. So let's have a look at the graph. This is age along the bottom, and then along the top we've got lean muscle mass, right? And this is all about muscle mass and muscle strength. As we age, obviously, typically, and this is only a kind of diagram really, there's a dotted line. We have less muscle mass as we age. It's not a straight line, but it shows you the general direction. The trouble is, this guy, at this point, he has an acute illness or an injury. Let's say he breaks his hip, as per the little picture on the left. That means he will stay in hospital for a bit, and then he'll lounge around recovering. I know he has to do exercises, but it's very tempting to just be sedentary and sit around. That means that person will lose a lot of muscle mass over these few days or weeks. He will then start to recover and regain a bit of muscle mass, but he won't quite get back to the dotted line. And then maybe a year later, there's another catabolic crisis. He might have got COVID. He might be suffering from something else where he has to lie down and recover. Every time you're sedentary, especially as you get older, you lose muscle mass. So you can see after a few catabolic crises, you can see that there's a big gap. There's a big gap now between what the dotted line should be and what the actual person is actually showing. And it's that gap which is actually quite serious. I've simplified it on this next chart, and I think this chart says it all quite nicely. Again, we've got muscle mass, strength, which indeed is related to quality of life on the left, and then along here is age. And again, early life, anabolism, adult life, and then older life, catabolism, where you have muscle loss. And you can see some people will be on this curve, some people will be on this steeper curve, and then eventually these people on this curve will cross what's called the disability threshold, below which they will become disabled to some extent. They will not be able to get around like they used to. They may even find out that they can't go shopping like they used to. They are, if you like, disabled to some extent. And there's a massive range between these people at the top and these people here. And that's what makes it interesting. This is a kind of illustration, what I'm talking about. And this is all about healthy aging. And I'm saying healthy aging is possible. A lot of people don't like the phrase. I quite like it, as long as you explain it. So again, if you look at the green here, as they get older, you get a decline, and then eventually that's it, normal aging. But you can slow aging, as per this dotted line, or you can stop aging, or you can even anti-age to some extent. And then, of course, this line is purely theoretical. That's perfect healthy aging, which doesn't exist. But anti-aging does exist. You can do certain things with your diet, exercise, sleep, stress, or whatever, that do have anti-aging properties. So just going back, a few facts. Muscle mass does predict mortality. It's very, very important. A lot of people do forget about the importance of muscle. N. Haynes, which is like the NDNS in the UK, a few years ago, 4,000 people plus, 55 years old and beyond. They measured skeletal muscle using bioelectrical impedance, technique which I'm sure you're well aware of. And it showed, they concluded that the measurement of muscle mass relative to body height should be added to the toolbox of doctors, clinicians caring for older adults. So understanding somebody's muscle mass relative to their height is just as important as BMI. BMI is quite crude, although it's a tool. If only we could actually measure muscle mass, that would give us a little bit more insight in terms of the potential health of that person. There are other consequences of age-related muscle loss or sarcopenia. Skeletal muscle is insulin dependent. It's a large glucose disposal. So when you eat carbs, sugars, most of those will be disposed into the muscle and also a little bit into the liver. If you've got a small amount of skeletal muscle, then obviously it's much more difficult to get rid of that glucose. potentially, if you have high glucose, that can lead on to type 2 diabetes, as you well know, due to hyperglycemia. It's also associated with metabolic disease, metabolic syndrome, things like which is truncal obesity, high triglycerides, low HDL, and high blood pressure, all of which can give rise to insulin resistance, i.e. type 2. Loss of strength, obviously, falls, and of course falls can lead to fractures, and fractures can lead ultimately to death. I know that it sounds a little bit over the top, but I will share a statistic with you. So 1 in 3 adults over 65 has a serious fall every year. And falls in older adults, like I keep saying, can be very serious. And hip fractures can actually be life-changing. One horrible statistic I've taken from a couple of the quite learned journals conclude that 27% of people die within 12 months. So you really don't want to be falling around and breaking hips as you get older, because over a quarter of people will not survive. My mother-in-law didn't survive 12 months when she broke a hip. My father never got out of bed, and he died within 3 months when he broke his hip. So breaking hips isn't as simple as people think. Resistance exercise and balance exercises are absolutely key. They are so protective against falling. But of course, very few older people do those exercises. And recovery from a hip hop is slow. It means there's a negative blip. Remember that thing I showed you 10 slides ago on the function versus age curve? Recovering from a hip is a big catabolic crisis. So you have to really put extra effort into trying to get onto the curve. You're unlikely, though, to regain normality unless you put in a huge effort. Again, the statistics say that only 25% of hip fracture victims ever regain their previous ability, which is sad. But studies do show that nonagenarians can build muscle mass. They can build strength. They can improve balance and gait speed. They can increase their chair raises, and they can lower their risk of falls. And it's never, never too late. There is so much that we can do to help. Summarizing this briefly before I move on. Older adults lose muscle fast, very fast compared to youngsters. They lose about 1 or 2% every year. That accelerates with age. So by the time you're 65, which is relatively young these days, a quarter of your muscle could be gone. And older people have a kind of anabolic resistance. So they can go to the gym, they can eat more protein, we'll talk about that later, but they have to work harder than younger people because they have this anabolic resistance. It's difficult to build muscle or maintain muscle as you get older. And as I said before, muscle weakness, it's the #1 risk factor for falls. And low muscle mass clearly is related to mortality, as I've said before, and also going into a home. Next chapter. Okay, so how do we combat sarcopenia for good health going forward? Now, this is one of the most famous studies on protein intake and muscle loss. This is called the Houston ABC study. It was done a few years ago on over 2,000 men and women, and they followed these people over 3 years with food diaries as well, trying to understand how much protein they were eating. And they measured every single one of them using DEXA. So it was a big, big study. This must have cost a huge amount of money. And they separated the people into different quintiles. And you can see quintile 1, they were the people who had lowest protein intake in their diet. And as you can see, they lost more muscle mass than anyone. Go back to the quintile 5, these were people who ate most protein. And you can see, even though they still lost a bit of muscle, which is classical aging, they lost less muscle. And you can see there's even a straight line. So this was a beautiful experiment, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that people who ate less protein compared to people who ate more protein, there was a massive difference in terms of losing muscle mass. So this experiment, which probably cost, I suspect, hundreds of thousands or maybe millions, is a beautiful piece of work. The RDA, let's talk about the RDA, or NRV as Europe call it these days. I'm saying quite clearly, and it's controversial, it's totally out of date. The RDA is an estimate of the minimum daily average dietary intake level that meets the nutrient requirements of 97.5% of healthy individuals. Okay, the official RDA, as you know, is 0.8 grams per kilo per day. That's around 60 grams. Let's put it into reality. It's around 60 grams for a 75 kilogram person. And that was based on old-fashioned studies called nitrogen balance studies. This is the minimum rather than the optimal, let's be honest. But many top scientists now believe that this minimum RDA should be at least 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo per day. And a lot of people say older adults need 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kilo per day. We're now talking, therefore, about 60 is totally inadequate. People, as they age, need around 100 grams of protein every day. And this is up-to-date science. This is not taught in the universities necessarily, but this is up-to-date science. So we need more protein. World Health Organization, they're still saying 0.8, which is around 60 grams a day. The latest science is at least 100 grams a day. But how do I eat 100 grams of protein? Let's try and make it real. Well, 100 grams of protein is around 4 chicken breasts. If you don't like chicken, 100 grams of protein is around 18 eggs. And if you're not a meat eater or a dairy eater, I haven't worked it out in terms of the amount of beans or broccoli, whatever, but it is a heck of a lot. In fact, you just won't be able to do it. Even getting 100 grams of chicken breast every day is impossible to most people. Certainly I wouldn't want to eat that. So getting 100 grams is difficult. And I know you get a little bit, 4 or 5 grams in your bread and toast and a few grams in your bran flakes, a little bit in your milk. But really getting 100 grams is very difficult. Now, a few years ago, there was the biggest ever study called the Protein Age Study, the PROT Age Study. It was published in JAMBA, that's a Journal of Medical Directors Association, in 2013. And they got together the best gerontologists and the best protein experts into a room. They threw away the key for a week, and these guys had to come back with a clear policy on maintaining muscle mass and RDA. So let's just go through some of the conclusions. So to maintain muscle, older people need more dietary protein than do younger people. So I keep saying to my kids who take protein shakes and they go down the gym, I need more protein than you, not less. The current RDA for protein, 0.8. Sorry, it's too low, it's out of date for older adults. Older adults should be consuming at least 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo per day. The per meal anabolic threshold of protein amino acid intake is higher in older adults. Okay, I'm slightly repeating myself there. But what some scientists are saying is we should be getting 25 to 30 grams of pure protein every meal, not just at dinner or tea time. And that protein should also contain about 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine. That's one of the most important building anabolic amino acids found in protein. We'll talk about leucine later because it is so fundamentally important. So the protein source is important, which we'll talk about in a sec. The timing is important. And what they're saying is amino acid and protein supplementation should be considered when making recommendations for dietary protein intake in older adults. They go on to say, and let's talk about chronic disease states. They say low protein diets will produce slower, less effective recovery from illness and chronic problems. Slower in terms of wound healing. So obviously a wound healing needs huge amounts of protein and longer hospital stays. Low protein intake is associated with greater frailty. Supplemental protein was found to reduce complications and rehabilitation time in hip fracture patients. And many studies show benefits of higher protein intake in patients with a whole range of chronic diseases, COPD, osteo, stroke, CVD, type 2. So older adults, again, they concluded 1.2 to 1.5 grams per kilo per day. So key messages from this massive study. Anabolic effects of amino acids and insulin on MPS, muscle protein synthesis, are enhanced by physical activity. So physical activity is really defined as resistance exercise. Endurance exercise is important, but resistance training, if you like going to the gym and pushing a few weights, brilliant, but you can do lots of body resistance exercise, and that's so important. Increased dietary protein. Let's try and get that 1.2 grams per kilo per day, that 100 grams of protein, and consider prescribing to people a 20-gram protein supplement after exercise sessions as well. Professor Paddon-Jones passed away recently, but he was a brilliant protein scientist. And again, he said the RDA for protein describes the quantity of protein required daily to prevent deficiency. So it's not optimal, it's just to prevent deficiency. And the most recent review of consensus statement, protein intake between 1 and 1.5 may confer health benefits. About 1/3 of adults over 50 fail to meet the RDA, a third. You read in some of the press, oh yes, we get lots of protein, nobody needs to supplement with protein, we get more than enough protein. I'm afraid it's not true. And if you look at the latest National Diet Nutrition Survey in the UK, and I've looked at the most recent data myself in a project I did with Hull University, I can't remember the exact stats, but I think it was between 70 and 80% of older adults are not getting the 100 grams of protein needed. I just missed that out. Okay. Paddon-Jones also was a great believer in trying to spread protein through the day. If you look at this dotted line in the middle, this is optimal protein consumption. You had to get enough protein to go above that dotted line to actually trigger MPS, muscle protein synthesis. At breakfast, most of us don't eat enough protein. We tend normally to eat a carb-rich type breakfast. Lunch may be the same, people eating salads and sandwiches and things. And dinner is where we tend to eat most protein. If we could try and get more protein in the early part of the day, that will have a beneficial effect. I put this slide in because it's quite relevant, and the title is Risk of Hip Fracture in Meat Eaters, Pescatarians and Vegetarians. This is results from a huge cohort study carried out in the UK. Basically, there's a growing concern with older women who are on vegetarian and vegan diets and hip fracture risk. And also they have low intakes of certain vitamins and things. I won't go into that yet. But the conclusion from the study, they found very clearly that vegetarians, but not occasional meat eaters or pescatarians, because they were getting quite a lot of protein, but vegetarians were at a 33% higher risk of hip fracture, 33% higher risk than regular meat eaters. Now, I'm not trying to encourage people to eat meat and fish. All I'm saying is, or doing is sharing that data. And there was another study called the EPIC Oxford cohort study, and they also found in their study that there was a 25% higher risk of hip fractures. So if you are a vegetarian, all I'm saying is you just have to make sure that you know what you're doing in terms of protein intake. But that's not good. If you are a woman and you're a vegetarian, you need to be very careful about osteoporosis. Let's move on to protein quantity and quality. And this is a great area. This is a really controversial area. So let me try and summarize some of these. So types of protein, because protein is a huge array of different molecules. And I've said here, not all amino acids, don't forget that was the building blocks of protein. So not all amino acids are created equal. There are 20 aminos, as I said before. And remember, there were 9 of those that are essential aminos. These are the aminos that you have to get from your diet. And they are key to building muscle. And then if you look at some of those essentials and go down to the 3 most important, they're called the BCAAs, the branch chain amino acids. Sorry, that's a slide title, it should be BCAA. So the BCAAs are even more key to anabolism. And the 3 are leucine, isoleucine, and valine. So you'll see this molecule, this amino acid called leucine, coming back again as being really key. So point 4, I'm saying here that high leucine containing and rapidly digested whey proteins, don't forget whey is about 20% of the milk protein, showed an advantage over casein, which is the rest of milk, if you like, 80% of the milk is casein, and soy proteins. So high leucine containing whey really showed a big advantage. There's no evidence that protein digestion and absorption capacities change with aging. But what they're saying is that fast proteins, proteins which absorb quickly and become available quickly and break down into their amino acids, have benefits over slow proteins. And they've also said that if you can enrich a protein with extra leucine or extra branched chain amino acids, that may help enhance muscle mass and muscle function. And again, I go back, I'm not trying to sell product here, but if I go back to the Prime 50 maintaining muscle product, we've enriched that, even though it's very high quality whey and milk protein, we've enriched that with additional leucine, because leucine has this incredible ability to trigger muscle protein synthesis. Protein quality. Well, protein quality is the ability to stimulate postprandial, i.e. after eating, muscle protein synthesis, okay? MPS depends on the amino acid profile, digestion and absorption. So if you take meats and fish, they're higher in percentage protein than plant-based. Soy is probably the most concentrated plant-based protein. So if you're into plant, then soy is a great protein. There are two ways of looking at protein quality, though, for muscle building. One is PDCAS, which I think a lot of you will have heard of. But more recently, that's like upgraded to a better way of looking at it called DIAS, which is digestible, indispensable amino acid score. A little bit technical. And the DIAS is even better than PDCAS because it accounts for what we call anti-nutrients. These are things like phytates, etc., that actually slow down the absorption of protein. So DIAS is a better indicator. It's a more practical way of looking at protein digestibility. We know that higher protein quality, therefore, higher DIAS is higher MPS. And if we can get extra leucine in there, that's this special branched chain amino acid, that's really quite a key catalyst, especially in older adults. There'll be lots of scientific papers published about the effect of leucine in older people. So let's look at this slightly controversial slide. There's always a debate about what's best, plant or animal proteins. Well, let's just go through some facts. So animal on the left, plant on the right. So first of all, animal proteins are typically much higher than plant proteins. Plant proteins might be as low as 3, going up to 12% protein, whereas meat and fish typically is between 20 and 30% protein. So it's a lot easier to get your protein from animal and dairy sources than plant. In terms of the amino acid profile, in other words, the individual amino acids which give maximum muscle building, in animal protein, you get the complete amino acid that exists in human muscle. Unfortunately, most of the plant proteins do not have complete amino acid profiles. The animal proteins are very high in these essential aminos. Remember, they are the ones that you have to ingest from your food. They are lower in plant proteins. They're higher in branched chain amino acids. They're lower in BCAAs in plants. They have a better DIAS score, digestibility score, lower in plant. Bad thing about animal protein, there's no fiber, whereas there's bags of fiber or lots of fiber in plant protein or plant sources, which is good. Animal proteins will have saturated fat, which are not great, whereas plant proteins will have very little saturated fats. But animal protein will give a higher muscle protein synthetic rate, whereas plant proteins typically won't be as good. So there are pros and cons. If you're a plant protein eater or a plant eater, you just have to know a little bit more about which plants to go for. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but if you look at the percentage of EAAs, that's the essential amino acids, the really important ones for muscle, you can see human muscle is on the right-hand side in black, and you can see above the dotted line, That's what, about 28%. So 28, human muscle is about 35% essential amino acids. So you can see egg, casein, whey, milk, these are all pretty high in terms of essential amino acids, whereas most of the others like hemp and wheat and oat are quite low. If you look at the leucine content, remember leucine was this really anabolic amino acid, really important for aging muscle. So let's look at the percentage of leucine here. Again, corn is very impressive in terms of leucine. That was a really surprising one to me. But whey typically and milk and casein are usually higher than most of the other plant proteins. And then finally, I'm not going to go through this, don't worry, it's just for your reference. You can look at the full breakdown of every single amino acid. So protein quality does affect the rate at which new muscle is formed, and that's really relevant to sarcopenia. So if I can just show you the DIAS scores, if you take whey protein isolate and whey protein concentrate, the DIAS score is 1 and above 1. If you go down to pea and rice, you're talking 0.3 and 0.8. So that really is just the technical DIAS scores, just for reference. So you can see that, on average, whey and egg and meat, etc., they will typically be better for muscle protein building than plant-based. Little bit technical, but it's quite a nice graph, and it's just another way of showing how important leucine is. This is time. These are 3 products. This one has high leucine, the dotted line at the top. You can see that's the high leucine product. You get above what's called the leucine threshold, below which you don't get much muscle building, above which you get a lot. So this is just popped above here, above the leucine threshold. That's protein number 1. And you can see on this separate score, protein 1 gave the most muscle protein synthetic response. And that's exactly what you'd predict. Rolling swiftly on to safety myths. And I know bone health and kidney health, they always come up when people are talking about protein. And it's a very controversial area. But let me try and share the facts with you. So protein and kidney health. First of all, what the kidneys do, they filter the blood. They're responsible for electrolyte homeostasis, keeping the electrolyte constant in our bodies. And then they secrete various things like vitamin D, calcitriol, also EPO, or erythropoietin, and also renin for blood pressure. So kidneys are really important, obviously. There is a belief going around social media and some health magazines that protein damages the kidneys. So recent investigation have found no benefit and potential harm in consuming a lower protein diet, even those people with CKD, chronic kidney disease. Recent guidelines aim for 0.8, even with CKD. And a meta-analysis where you look at a load of different RCT studies, they have concluded that no difference in GFR, that's the health of the kidney, stands for glomerular filtration rate. There's no difference between low and medium protein at 0.9 versus high protein at 1.8. And there is little evidence linking high protein to the onset of kidney disease. Look at the Nurses' Health Study, 1,600 women, food diary, blood tests, urine tests. High protein intake was not associated with a change in GFR. But in women with renal insufficiency, where they had real problems, protein intake was associated with a change in filtration rate. Go to the protein age study again. We've already mentioned some stuff from their protein age study. Recommends daily intakes at least in the range of 1 to 1.2 grams protein per kilo per day, the 100 grams I'm talking about. And they concluded those who have acute or chronic disease need even more protein. And older adults with severe kidney disease are an exception to this rule. These individuals may need to limit protein intake. WHO, what's their view on high protein safety? They've said the decline in GFR that occurs with advancing age in healthy subjects can be attenuated by reducing the protein in the diet. And they've said, sorry, that's wrong. It appears to have no foundation at all. And protein restriction on the grounds of renal function is justifiable and prudent only in subjects who are likely to develop kidney failure. Okay. So that's kidneys. Let's talk about bone. And this was a systematic review from the NOS, the National Osteoporosis Society. I recently presented on healthy aging to the NOS. We had a very interesting day. And they concluded, having looked at 15 randomized controlled tests, the current evidence showed no adverse effects of higher protein intakes on bone health. And they go on to say there was even positive trends on bone mineral density at most bone sites. What about world health? Protein and bone health. Protein has a direct anabolic effect on bone matrix. Remember, bones consist of about 30% protein. So bones need protein. And a low protein intake leads to bone loss, according to WHO. And a higher protein intake is associated with high calcium as well. Protein supplements increase IGF-1 and reduce femur loss in hip fracture victims. So they conclude, after all of this, dietary protein as part of a well-balanced diet is most likely to be beneficial for bone, possibly at dietary levels in excess of the RDA. Finally, let's conclude with non-protein supplementation. We've talked about protein so much. I think I've sort of done it to death, but it is such a fundamentally important nutrient. Well, if you look at some recommendations from an expert panel in the US, they concluded that high protein intake between 1 and 1.5 was important. Exercise was important. Measuring vitamin D is important, and supplementing with high levels of D2 or D3 is important to try and avoid sarcopenia. They talk about leucine and BCAA-enriched supplementation, and they even talked about supplementing with creatine. We're not going to mention creatine yet, but I'm a great believer and supporter of creatine. So how to prevent muscle loss over time? So they concluded resistance exercise is the single most important thing to do. But you need to back that up with good nutrition. Protein, we've talked about. Essential amino acids, we talked about, and leucine. Creatine is for another day, but creatine can increase explosivity and therefore muscle building. Omega-3 fatty acids, we've got a slide on that in a second, but that's an interesting one. And polyphenols are interesting. They're anti-inflammatory. And then something you may not have heard of, HMB. We'll talk about that. We should also avoid hypocaloric diets. If you're on a diet and you're drinking and eating less calories than your RDA, you're going to lose weight, definitely. But you will also lose muscle mass as part of that weight loss. So you do have to be careful. And they concluded that leucine specifically has been reported to be the crucial amino acid to try and combat muscle loss. So going to omega-3, and by omega-3 I'm talking DHA and EPA, both of which I'm sure you're well aware of. Muscle wasting is linked to what they call chronic inflammation, or inflammaging, as some of us call it. There's lots of nasty cytokines and anti-inflammatory agents like IL-6, IL-1, and TNF-alpha floating around. The main PUFAs are DHA and EPA. ALA found in plant is nowhere near as effective. And the conversion rate to DHA EPA is very poor, it's less than 10%. So DHA and EPA have been proven to reduce the production of these nasty inflammatory molecules, such as prostaglandins, thromboxanes, and leukotrienes. And there was a massive anti-inflammatory effect from DHA and EPA. I don't want to get too technical with this, but I just thought you'd be interested for the record. This is a classic forest plot, as it's called. And this is just a summary. This is a meta-analysis. This is a summary of lots of trials that were done. There's millions of pounds worth of trials here on a single page. And this is from PubMed, Medline, 123 studies. I've just put a few up there. But basically, a blue dot on the right means there's it favors omega-3. A blue dot on the left says it favors the placebo. And then you add all the tests up. Some statistician goes through it in great detail. The green dot on the right at the bottom here is on the right-hand side, and it's significant. So basically, that's concluding that PUFAs, DHA, EPA, omega-3, do have a positive effect on lean body mass, i.e. muscle. So that is a fantastic result for omega-3. Same thing on strength and grip, so I won't go through that. Just briefly mentioned HMB. A lot of people have not heard of HMB. This is hydroxymethylbutyrate, and it has great potential. It's a metabolite of leucine, so there's the magic leucine appearing again, so it's a very closely related molecule, and it's naturally made in the body. But if you're going to give HMB to people, the recommended dose is about 3 to 6 grams every day, and it's proven in trials to preserve muscle mass in older adults. It's also used in cachexia as well, which is interesting. If you look at some of the medical foods, like Ensure, one of the medical foods or drinks for cachexic and older patients, they actually have a few grams of HMB formulated into that product. It mitigates muscle loss with aging, disease, or exercise stress by attenuating protein degradation. That's how it works. It tries to slow down the degradation of muscle. It also enhances MPS, muscle protein synthesis. It inhibits muscle wasting, like I said. It has a positive effect on myogenesis, that's new muscle formation, and it inhibits apoptosis, that's death of muscle cells. This is another study, and if you just look at the box, the conclusion of this was calcium HMB improved total lean mass, strength, and function with and without exercise. I'm not saying don't exercise, but even if you're not exercising, it still had a really good effect. And there's more data there. Here. Okay, and there's more data there. I won't go through that. There was another study here in nutrients, nutrition and sarcopenia. What do we know? They have looked at huge cohort studies and RCTs, and they've shown that low protein is associated with loss of muscle mass and strength. Okay, big deal. We all know that now. Exercise plays a key role, especially resistance. And they're saying that we should be eating between 1.2 and 1.5 grams per kilo per day, i.e. over 100 grams. And BCAAs and leucine, we've mentioned that so many times now, in particular showed an increased level of muscle protein synthesis. And then final chapter is micronutrients and age. A lot of people forget about the effect of micronutrients, minerals and vitamins, etc. So let's quickly go through these. Now, most of you probably will have heard of EFSA, European Food Safety Authority. And you cannot make a claim for any nutrient product unless EFSA have given you permission, and they have this huge list of EFSA claims. So I've just quickly headlined some micronutrients where EFSA allow us to make claims if we have it at a certain level in our product. That means that the science behind this is phenomenal. It's very, very high quality. So folic acid contributes to amino acid synthesis. That's great. That's the building block of protein. B6 contributes to normal protein and glycogen metabolism. Vitamin D, very important, helps maintenance of normal muscle function. Zinc, normal protein synthesis. That's exactly what we want to preserve muscle. Potassium, believe it or not, it's not just blood pressure. Potassium contributes to normal muscle function. Molybdenum, normal sulfur amino acid metabolism. There's 2 or 3 very important aminos that are based around sulfur. Magnesium, you'll know about that. It contributes to normal muscle function and helps make new protein. Calcium contributes to normal muscle function. And then, of course, protein, we're allowed to talk about growth and also maintenance. Why are micronutrients so important now? Because we are deficient in many of those. This is a fascinating study done over 20 years ago. And they found that if you look at the I think it was over 65, this shows you the percentage of over 65 not getting the RDA in their diet. Look at vitamin D, 90%. Look at magnesium, 80%. Look at potassium. That's saying that most of us are really far away from getting enough of these key micronutrients. I've repeated that work myself with students at Hull University. I won't go through all the data, but you can see anywhere between 30 and 90% of people are hopelessly deficient in many, many key micronutrients. And many of those, we mentioned potassium, magnesium, vitamin D, they will all affect muscle mass and muscle strength and muscle health. Antioxidants. We know that oxidative stress, inflammation, is a contributor to losing muscle. High metabolism in muscle, therefore high rates of energy production, therefore high rates of oxidative stress, therefore attack. ROS, oxidative stress, is balanced by a variety of things like superoxide dismutase, glutathione, etc., dietary antioxidants. You don't want too many antioxidants in the system, but you want some. And many of us older adults are not getting enough antioxidants in our diet. We know that low selenium, low vitamin E, low carotenoids, that's associated with poor muscle function in some huge study called the Chianti study. High vitamin C is associated with muscle quality, Japanese study. And even things like zeaxanthin, lutein, lycopene, people who had higher levels had higher grip strength. But the data is a little bit inconsistent. Briefly going through this, vitamin D, huge amount of legal claims approved for normal muscle function. It must work. Most of us are really deficient in vitamin D. Many trials have shown that low vitamin D patients are associated with poor muscle function. B vitamins. If you're low in B vitamins, you'll be tired and therefore you'll probably be sedentary. That's not good. You're going to lose muscle mass if you're lounging around. But there are many studies linking low B vitamins to lower muscle function. Vitamin D deficiency, we talked about D briefly. You can measure vitamin D in the blood plasma, it's 125 hydroxy vitamin D, and older adults, unfortunately, do not have enough of this vitamin D in their system. That will, we don't make vitamin D in our skin even when we go into bright sunlight nearly as effectively as when we were young. Most of us have a dietary deficiency. It's difficult to get D from the diet, let's be honest. Most older people will have, let's say, a bit more skin covering. They'll go outside less. They might be using sunscreen, and they have metabolic alterations. So vitamin D is really, really lacking in older adults. It's also associated with things like reduced muscle mass, less strength, poorer gait, slower GUG, that's get up and go. There's a test called a GUG test, get up and go test, for a balance and increased risk of falls. Magnesium, I won't go through all of these, but I'm trying to show you that there's a lot of data around showing that some of these micronutrients are absolutely essential for strength and muscle. Minerals and sarcopenia, there's been a massive systematic review. Dietary mineral intake and muscle mass strength, physical, sarcopenia, age 65 plus, 3,000 people plus, 10 huge studies. Basically, they're saying serum selenium and calcium is associated with muscle mass. Magnesium, iron, and zinc are associated with good physical performance. Low magnesium, selenium, calcium, phosphorus is associated with sarcopenia, and magnesium helps improve physical performance. There are many, many, many studies. So in summary, for vitamins, vitamin D, vitamin C, B6, B12, and vitamin E, there are many, many studies showing that these are essential micronutrients. Again, I've not got time to go through each line, but you can read it at leisure. And it's the same with minerals. Calcium, low in calcium is associated with sarcopenia. Selenium, the big Chianti cohort. Selenium protects muscle from this horrible oxidative stress. Same with magnesium. It's involved in energy metabolism, but also MPS, muscle protein synthesis. And like I said before, 10 slides ago, omega-3 fatty acids. Huge cross-sectional study done, and it showed that you could improve frailty metrics, and you could improve muscle protein synthesis. So 1 minute, we're just finished. So I think it's my penultimate slide. Don't forget, though, to fight fatigue. It's the #1 complaint in the over 50s. And when we interviewed them, they came up with all these things. I'm always tired, I can't exercise, I'm littered with pain. So there was always good reason why they were not exercising. And this is what I call my sort of famous vicious cycle to frailty. So if you look at the very top circle, sarcopenia, reduced muscle tissue, that puts more stress on the joints. We end up with physical complaints, maybe sore joints, stiff joints, which means it's harder for us to become active, which means we're going to be less active, we're going to lounge around a bit more, which means, guess what? We're going to reduce more muscle tissue. That's not good. So the main areas to manage, in my opinion at least, number one priority is resistance exercise. If we can get people to do that 3 times a week, and it doesn't have to be going down the gym, that will make a huge difference. If we can get them to supplement with whey protein or milk proteins, aiming for that 100 grams a day, that will make a big difference. And if they can take some HMB as well, 3 grams a day, either in the supplement or maybe as a supplement, separate supplement, that could make a difference. Ensuring that their vitamin D levels are sufficient is fundamental, often forgotten when we talk about muscle health. And if we can make sure that any supplement they're taking contains magnesium, selenium, and calcium, that's obviously going to be a good thing. Let's not forget the good old antioxidants, not huge amounts, because antioxidants are a bit controversial. There's a lot of papers saying that they're not as good as people make them out to be. But I think we should get at least the RDA in those antioxidants. And I know from the studies, the NDNS studies, that both C and also E are sadly lacking in most over 50s. If we can get people to take omega-3 fish oil or krill oil containing large amounts of DHA, EPA, that has to be a good thing. It's anti-inflammatory, that's bound to help muscle health. And if we can make sure that they get enough B vitamins, especially B6, B12, 9, folic acid, that will keep homocysteine under control. And we know homocysteine is associated with cardiovascular disease. It's also associated with inflammatory problems. And the number one priority is to stay active. Stay active. That is the number one priority. That is the end. It's what, 1 hour and 10, so it was a little bit longer than I wanted, but there is so much to say about muscle health. And I do hope you've found it interesting. I do hope you've learned something as well.